Everyone thought there was nothing valuable in her grandpa's garage. But when she cleaned it out after his death and lifted an old cover, her life changed forever. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The town of Boulder, Colorado, lay beneath a heavy sky, the kind that pressed down on rooftops and hillsides and seemed to swallow sound itself. It was autumn, and the air carried the bite of cold rain that had fallen through the night, leaving the streets slick with reflections of gray clouds. At the edge of town, near a modest cemetery, where the grass had grown long and uneven, a small gathering stood in silence. They had come not out of obligation, but out of a faint sense of neighborly duty, a few faces that had known the man in passing. The rest of the family had not appeared, and no one was surprised by that. The casket was plain, chosen by necessity rather than choice. It rested above the dark cut of earth, and beside it stood the only person who truly belonged there. Emily Harper, granddaughter of Jonathan Jack Harper. She held her coat tightly closed against the cold breeze, her hands white at the knuckles where they gripped the bouquet of chrysanthemums she had bought the night before. Her breath fogged in the morning air, and she stared at the casket with a mixture of sorrow and quiet fury. Jack Harper had lived 82 years, most of them in the modest house he had purchased long ago on the edge of town. To the family, he had been little more than a stubborn old man who wasted his life tinkering with machines and hiding in a garage filled with useless junk. To them, he was a relic, a burden, a man who refused to move with the times. They called him a fool behind his back and sometimes to his face, and in the last years of his life, they had drifted away entirely. He had been left with his tools, his house, and his solitude. Emily had been different. As a child, she had clung to his stories, the strange fragments of tales about roads that seemed endless and skies that stretched without end. He had taught her how to ride a bicycle on the cracked pavement in front of his house, had cheered her when she fell and told her that falling was part of learning to ride. She remembered afternoons when he let her sit on his knee and showed her magazines filled with gleaming motorcycles, the images so unreal and powerful that they had felt like another world. Even as she grew older and busy with school and the expectations of life, she always found time to visit him, to bring groceries, to listen to his voice even when it became raspy and faint. When the cancer had advanced and his body grew frail, she had been the only one to sit beside his bed. Night after night, she held his hand as he struggled to breathe, reading to him in a voice that wavered, though she tried to keep it steady. She was there on the morning when he slipped away, his fingers cold but his eyes still gentle, watching her as though she was the only proof that his life had mattered. And now she was here, standing alone, paying for the service from her own savings, while her relatives laughed at her over the phone for wasting money on an old man who had nothing. The funeral was quiet, stripped of grandeur. A pastor spoke briefly, offering words that felt detached, as though reciting a script rather than honoring a life. The neighbors shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward Emily with sympathy, but they too seemed out of place, their presence shallow in comparison to the decades of sacrifice and loneliness the man had endured. When the casket was lowered, Emily knelt and placed the single leather glove she had found in his room atop the flowers. The glove was cracked, worn smooth from years of use, but she had known immediately that it belonged with him. It was the last thing of his she could give back. As the dirt began to fall, she whispered her own promise, inaudible to anyone else. She would not forget him. She would not let the family's scorn define him. She would carry his memory even if no one else cared to. Her voice shook, but her words were steady. She stood as the others drifted away, offering brief nods or murmurs of condolence before hurrying back to their lives. Within minutes, the cemetery was empty, and Emily remained the only one still by the grave, her eyes fixed on the fresh mound of earth. When at last she walked back to her car, the streets of Boulder felt deserted, the silence pressing on her ears. She drove toward the outskirts of town, to the small house where Jack Harper had lived his final years. The house stood alone, its paint peeling, its porch sagging slightly, yet it carried the weight of permanence. She parked in front and sat for a moment, staring at the place that had always smelled of oil, leather, and the faint trace of smoke from an old wood stove. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the echoes of his presence. The living room was sparse. A worn recliner, shelves lined with books on mechanics and road maps, a faded rug. On the wall hung a black and white photograph of Jack as a young man, wearing a leather jacket and leaning casually against something Emily could not quite see in the dim light. His eyes in the picture were sharp, alive, full of something that seemed foreign compared to the frail man she had known at the inn. She moved through the room slowly, touching the surfaces as though the texture of wood and fabric might preserve him. In the bedroom, she found a box tucked beneath the bed. Inside were patches and badges, stitched with the name Iron Wolves MC. There were faded photographs of groups of men in leather, standing in front of long lines of motorcycles, their faces shadowed by sun and distance. She had never heard him speak of a club, never understood why his gaze sometimes drifted as though he was remembering roads she had never traveled. The discovery unsettled her, but it also pulled at something inside her, as though the edges of a story were beginning to reveal themselves. She thought of the phone call from her uncle the night before, telling her to clear out the house quickly, to sell what she could, to tear down the old garage that was falling apart and worthless. They wanted the land, not the memory. She had not answered him. Now, standing in the dim bedroom, she decided she would not answer them again until she had gone through every inch of the place herself. Outside the window, at the back of the property, the garage loomed. Its roof sagged under the weight of years, and its iron doors were streaked with rust. She remembered how, as a child, she had begged to see inside, only for her grandfather to shake his head and tell her gently that some places were meant to stay closed. She had never been allowed through those doors, and her imagination had filled the darkness with mystery. Now she was the only one with the key, the only one who could decide whether the silence of that garage would continue. She stepped outside into the yard, the grass brittle under her shoes. The sun was sinking behind the hills, casting the garage in long shadow. She approached slowly, her heart beating faster with each step. The padlock hung heavy on the door, its surface mottled with rust, but the shape of it was familiar. She remembered seeing him with keys in his pocket, jangling them softly as he walked, always with a kind of weight that suggested importance. She held the keys she had taken from his drawer earlier in the day, turning them in her hand. One of them had to fit. The air smelled of dust and earth. The silence deepened, and she realized she was holding her breath. The lock clicked open with a reluctant groan, the sound sharp in the stillness. The doors shuddered as she pushed, the hinges screaming from years without oil. A gust of air rushed out, heavy with the scent of old metal, oil, and time. Inside was darkness, broken only by the thin shafts of sunlight that cut through cracks in the roof. And there in the gloom she saw them, massive shapes beneath heavy tarps, their outlines sharp and deliberate. Her pulse quickened, and she stepped forward once, then stopped. She could not bring herself to pull the covers away, not yet. The weight of the funeral, of the empty house, of the discovery of the patches and photographs, all of it pressed against her. She let the doors fall closed again, the echo ringing in her ears. Not tonight. She walked back toward the house, her steps slow, her eyes still fixed on the garage. Something waited inside, something that her grandfather had guarded from everyone, even from her. The family saw only a stubborn old man who wasted his life. Emily felt, for the first time, that they had been wrong. He had carried something deeper, something worth hiding. She entered the house again and sat in his chair, her hands trembling as she pressed them against her face. The silence wrapped around her, thick and unbroken. But beneath it was a hum, a sense of unfinished business. The funeral had closed one chapter of her life, but another was waiting, heavy with dust and shadow, sealed behind the iron doors at the back of the yard. And she knew that soon, very soon, she would open them. The night after the funeral passed in fragments, restless and uneven. Emily lay awake on the sagging couch in her grandfather's living room, listening to the old house creak and settle around her as though it were alive, mourning along with her. Sleep drifted close but never settled, slipping away each time her mind replayed the day. Each time she saw again the dark shape of the garage in the yard behind the house. When dawn finally came, pale and cold, she rose with heavy eyes and an ache deep in her chest. The air inside the house was sharp with dust, and the faint light slanted through curtains her grandfather had not drawn in years. She moved slowly through the rooms, letting her hand trail over the furniture, the chipped paint on door frames, the photographs that clung to the walls like whispers of another life. The living room, small and cluttered, carried his presence most clearly. On the mantel sat an old clock that still ticked with steady rhythm, unaware that the life it had measured was gone. Beside it were framed pictures, some faded into near obscurity. One caught her attention. Her grandfather as a younger man, standing in front of a line of motorcycles, his face shadowed beneath a leather cap, his grin quick and alive. She had never seen him like that before, full of a vitality that seemed impossible to reconcile with the man who had coughed softly in his bed in those final days. The kitchen told another story. Rows of mason jars lined the shelves, some filled with nails, bolts, screws, others still clinging to their original purpose with spices and dried herbs now colorless with age. The table bore the marks of a man who had eaten alone for years, one chair pulled slightly back, worn in a way the others were not. She opened drawers and found utensils dulled by decades of use, scraps of paper with numbers and notes scrawled in a hand she recognized. Everywhere she looked, the house resisted emptiness. It was still his, every corner steeped in him. In the bedroom, she found the first true signs that her family had never known him. Beneath the bed, in a long-forgotten trunk, she discovered patches and badges embroidered with a wolf's head and the words Iron Wolves MC. Folded beneath them were leather vests, cracked with age, their backs marked with the same snarling emblem. She traced the stitching with her fingertips, her heart racing. In an envelope tucked into the lining of the trunk were photographs, black and white images of men astride gleaming motorcycles, their faces hard, their stances proud, and always the wolf patch on their jackets. In one photograph, unmistakable even in youth, was her grandfather, grinning with the unrestrained confidence of a man who knew the road belonged to him. The discovery unsettled her. He had never spoken to her of a club, never explained why his eyes sometimes wandered as though replaying memories too vivid to share. To the family he had been a recluse, tinkering endlessly in his garage. But here was proof of another life altogether, a life bound to something larger, something that carried meaning beyond the quiet walls of his modest home. Her phone buzzed on the dresser, the shrill vibration breaking the stillness. She let it ring at first, reluctant to shatter the moment, but eventually she picked it up. It was her uncle again, his voice impatient, cold. He asked if she had begun sorting through the house, if she had arranged for the land to be sold, if she understood that no one wanted to deal with his junk. "Clear the garage," he told her flatly. "There's nothing in there worth saving, probably just rust and mice." He laughed before hanging up, leaving Emily staring at the blank screen with a heat rising in her chest. They did not understand. They never had. The house, the garage, the fragments of the past tucked away in boxes, they all carried more than her family would ever care to admit. For them it was land to be stripped, items to be sold. For her it was something sacred, though she could not yet name why. She replaced the phone on the dresser, her decision firming within her. She would not rush. She would not sell. She would walk through every room, touch every piece, and give them all the respect her grandfather had been denied in life. By late afternoon, when the light grew long and the air took on the chill of approaching evening, she stepped outside. The yard was quiet, the grass brittle beneath her shoes, and at the far end the garage loomed. Its roof sagged with age, its walls streaked with rust, but it stood with the same kind of stubbornness she had always felt in her grandfather himself. She remembered the times as a child when she had crept toward those doors, trying to peek through the narrow gap, only to feel his hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm, guiding her away. He had never been angry, but he had always been absolute. "Some doors stay closed," he had said once, his voice low, almost sad. Now those words returned to her as she approached. The heavy padlock still hung there, the metal mottled with rust, the loop stiff but intact. She reached into her pocket and drew out the ring of keys she had taken from the drawer in his desk. They were old, their edges dulled, but one of them had to fit. She hesitated, turning them over in her palm, her breath catching as though she were about to cross a threshold into a part of him she was never meant to see. She chose one key and slid it into the lock. It resisted at first, grinding stubbornly, but then, with a groan that seemed almost like a sigh, the lock yielded. The sound rang in the air, sharp and final. Emily's chest tightened as she pulled the heavy loop free and let it dangle in her hand. With effort, she pushed at the doors, the hinges shrieking in protest. The gap widened slowly, releasing a breath of air that smelled of oil, leather, and long-forgotten time. Dust swirled in the shaft of sunlight that broke through, and the shadows inside began to take form. She stepped forward, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. What she saw made her stop, her breath catching. There, lined against the far wall, were enormous shapes hidden beneath tarps that sagged with dust. Their outlines were too precise, too deliberate to be ordinary clutter. Each form bore the unmistakable silhouette of a machine: broad tires, curved frames, handlebars arching into the gloom. Her heart hammered in her chest as she took another step, the sound of her shoes against the concrete floor echoing too loudly in the silence. She could hear her own breathing, quick and shallow, the pulse in her ears like a drum. The weight of years seemed to press down on her shoulders, the sense that she was trespassing into a sanctuary he had guarded fiercely until the very end. She reached for the corner of the nearest tarp, her hand trembling. The fabric was stiff, heavy with dust. She tugged at it gently, but then stopped. Something inside her whispered caution. Not yet. She was not ready to see what lay beneath. The grief of the past days still clung too tightly, the funeral too fresh in her mind. The garage was not just a room filled with machines. It was the heart of his secrecy, the part of himself he had hidden from the world. She let the tarp fall back into place and turned away, her throat tight. The doors groaned as she pulled them shut again, the sound booming like the closing of a chapter not yet ready to be read. She slipped the lock back through its place, though she did not bother to fasten it, and stepped away, her gaze lingering on the dark outline of the garage against the evening sky. As she walked back toward the house, the chill deepened, and the wind tugged at her hair. Behind her, the garage stood silent, its secret sealed again. She knew, however, that she would return. She could feel it as surely as she felt her own heartbeat. The house had begun to whisper pieces of him to her, the patches, the photographs, the faint traces of another life. But the garage would tell the full story. She only needed the courage to face it. She climbed the porch steps and pushed open the door, the familiar creak of the hinges greeting her like a voice. Inside, the house was dark, but it no longer felt entirely empty. It carried the weight of something unfinished, something waiting. She sank into his chair once more, the fabric molded to his shape, and closed her eyes. For a moment she imagined she could hear the distant rumble of engines, the kind of sound he must have once lived for. The night deepened around her, and the house settled into silence. Emily sat still, her mind restless, her heart unsteady. Yet in that silence she felt the certainty grow. She would uncover everything, piece by piece, until the truth of who he had been stood clear before her. The family had abandoned him, dismissed him, laughed at him, but she would not. And somewhere outside, in the shadows of the locked garage, his story waited. The following morning came pale and uncertain, the sun hidden behind a veil of thin clouds that spread across the sky like worn fabric. Emily woke late, her body aching as though she had spent the night carrying burdens too heavy for her frame. The air inside the house was still and sharp with the scent of age and dust. And when she sat up on the couch, her eyes fell immediately toward the back of the house, as though she could see through the walls to where the garage stood. The memory of unlocking the doors the evening before returned with force. The smell of oil, the outlines beneath the tarps, the weight of something vast and secret pressing against her. She had turned away then, too raw, too uncertain. But now, with the silence of the house pressing on her ears, she knew she could not leave the truth covered forever. She brewed a small cup of coffee in the kitchen, the old machine sputtering in protest, filling the air with the scent of bitter grounds. As she sat at the table, hands wrapped around the warm mug, she thought of her family. They would want to strip this house quickly, empty it into bins and trucks, sell the land for profit. They would never take the time to walk through it slowly, to sit in his chair, to open trunks filled with patches and photographs. They would never step into the garage with reverence, and that was why it had to be her. She was the only one who had stood at his side when his breath grew shallow, the only one who had not mocked him in his final days. The responsibility lay with her alone. When she finished her coffee, she walked outside into the cool morning. The grass was damp with dew, soaking the hems of her jeans as she crossed the yard. The garage stood silent, a dark figure waiting at the edge of the property, its rusted skin gleaming faintly under the gray light. She carried the key in her hand, already turned warm against her skin, and when she reached the door, she wasted no time. The padlock gave way easily now, as though accepting her claim. The hinges groaned again, but she pushed firmly, forcing the doors wide until the dim interior spread before her. Dust hung in the beams of light that filtered through the roof. The air smelled of old oil, leather, and iron. Her footsteps echoed across the concrete floor as she approached the first of the shapes. It loomed just ahead, draped in a tarp stiff with age, the outline of broad tires and curved handlebars unmistakable. She reached forward, her fingers trembling, and gripped the edge of the fabric. With a sharp pull, she lifted it, coughing as a cloud of dust swirled around her. Beneath the tarp stood a machine that made her heart stutter. Chrome gleamed faintly beneath years of neglect, and the lines of the frame were unmistakable. A Harley-Davidson knucklehead from 1947, its engine design legendary, its presence almost regal in the dim light. The black paint had dulled with time, the leather seat cracked, but the essence of it radiated power. Emily's knees weakened, and she reached out, her hand hovering above the surface before finally daring to touch the cool metal of the tank. She had seen photographs of motorcycles in books, in magazines, in the movies her grandfather sometimes watched in silence, but never had she been so close to something that felt alive even in stillness. She circled it slowly, her fingers trailing along the handlebars. The headlamp, the broad tires flat against the floor. She imagined the sound it must have once made, the deep growl of an engine tearing through empty highways, her grandfather's hands steady on the grips as the wind whipped past him. For a moment she could almost see him there, younger, stronger, the man from the faded photographs rather than the frail figure in his bed. Her breath still unsteady, she moved to the second tarp. This one was larger, the shape broader, its silhouette carrying the grace of another era. She pulled the cover free and gasped. Before her stood an Indian chief from 1953, its sweeping fenders still painted with the faint outline of hand-drawn feathers. The emblem of a bird's wing stretched across the tank. Leather saddlebags hung at the sides, worn but intact, as though waiting for another long journey. The bike carried a presence different from the Harley, less aggressive, more elegant, as if it had been crafted for the long road, for endless miles under open skies. Emily pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes stinging with tears. She knew enough to understand that these were not scraps, not junk, but treasures. Machines like this were rare, priceless to collectors, almost impossible to find in such condition. Yet here they were, standing silently in her grandfather's garage, hidden from the world by tarps and dust. Her mind reeled with questions. How had he acquired them? Why had he never told her, never told anyone? Had he kept them as reminders of a life he could not return to, or as secrets too precious to share with those who would not understand? She thought of her family again, of their laughter, their dismissal of him as a fool. If they had known what sat here, they would have sold them without hesitation, stripped them for money, discarded the rest. Perhaps that was why he had kept his silence. Perhaps he had known that one day only she would stand here, the only one to see him as he truly was. In the far corner of the garage stood an old workbench covered in papers, tools, and tins of bolts and screws. Drawers sagged from their weight, handles rusted, surfaces coated in years of grime. Emily pulled one open and found stacks of photographs curled at the edges. She carried them into the light and spread them across the bench. The images showed men standing beside rows of motorcycles, their leather jackets marked with the Wolf's Head emblem. Some photographs captured racing tracks, crowds gathered in bleachers, her grandfather leaning against his bike with a cigarette and a grin. Others showed wide-open roads, desert highways stretching beneath burning skies. Jack Harper at the center of it all, his eyes alive with freedom. Emily studied them with awe, her heart swelling with pride. He had not been a forgotten man wasting away in solitude. He had been part of something vast, something enduring. At the bottom of the stack lay a photograph unlike the others. It was a portrait, faded but powerful, of Jack standing beside a custom-built motorcycle with the Iron Wolves patch sewn large across the back of his vest. He was younger than she had ever seen him, his hair long, his stance unshaken. Beneath the image, written in his hand, were the words, Iron Wolves MC, 1967. Emily's hands shook as she held the photo. She thought of how he had looked in his final days, frail and silent, how the family had mocked him for clinging to a past they never cared to understand. Yet here was proof that his past had not been empty. It had been rich with roads and machines, with loyalty and brotherhood. She gathered the photographs into a neat stack, returning them gently to the drawer, then turned back toward the two motorcycles gleaming faintly in the dust. They stood like guardians, monuments to a life lived far from the scorn of his children. The garage seemed to pulse with presence, every shadow filled with echoes of engines that had once roared here. Emily's sorrow mingled with wonder, her grief transformed into something deeper, something steadier. She sank onto a stool by the workbench, her eyes never leaving the Harley and the Indian. Around her the silence was no longer heavy, but alive, humming with the memory of the man she had loved. She realized then that she had only just begun to uncover the truth. The tarps that still draped the other shapes waited, hiding stories she had yet to learn. The photographs, the patches, the machines themselves, all of it pointed to a legacy far beyond what she had been told. Night began to fall before she left the garage. She pulled the doors closed carefully, as though sealing away something sacred, and locked them once more. As she walked back to the house, the cool air brushed her face, and she felt a strength growing within her, a determination that would not be shaken. Her grandfather had been more than they believed. She was the one who had seen it, the one who would remember, the one who would carry it forward. Inside, she sat again in his chair, clutching the photograph marked with the year 1967. She closed her eyes, and for a moment the silence around her was filled with the distant growl of engines, the roar of the open road, the voice of a man who had never truly been broken. And in that moment she understood. This was only the beginning. When morning returned, the air felt charged with an energy that Emily could not ignore. She had barely slept. The images of the Harley and the Indian chief returning to her mind again and again, until she felt as though she had lived a second life within her dreams, riding beside her grandfather on roads she had never known. As she pushed open the back door of the house and stepped into the yard, the garage seemed to call to her, its shadow long across the grass, its silence heavy with invitation. The discoveries of the previous day had left her shaken, but also determined. She could not leave the rest of the shapes beneath their covers, not when they waited like monuments to a past that her family had denied. She unlocked the doors once more, the hinges groaning in protest as she pushed them wide. The smell of oil and rust met her again, layered with dust that glittered faintly in the shafts of light falling from the roof. The two motorcycles she had uncovered stood tall, gleaming faintly, guardians of what was yet hidden. She paused to look at them again, to let her hand brush over their tanks as though greeting old friends, then turned to the tarps that still concealed the rest. Her heart pounded as she approached the nearest one. With steady hands, she pulled at the heavy cover. It slid to the ground in a puff of dust, and her breath caught. Before her stood a Harley-Davidson panhead from the 1950s, its body strong and lean, the iconic engine shining even after decades in hiding. The chrome glinted beneath the dust. The seat bore the marks of use, and she could almost hear the deep thrum of its engine reverberating through the garage. She stepped closer, running her hand along the polished tank, marveling at the craftsmanship and the care her grandfather must have poured into keeping it alive. She turned to the next tarp, larger and older. When she dragged it free, she gasped again. There stood an Indian Scout, its design elegant and compact, the year unmistakable 1928. Nearly a century old, Yet its form remained proud, a relic of another time. She crouched to examine the tires, cracked with age but still intact, and felt a shiver run down her spine. Machines like this belonged in museums, she thought, and yet here it stood, silent and waiting, in the dim light of her grandfather's garage. Her eyes moved to the corner, where another tarp covered a frame taller and more imposing than the rest. She approached slowly, her pulse quickening, and pulled it back in a single motion. What emerged from the shadows made her whisper aloud despite herself. A Vincent Black Shadow, the legendary British motorcycle once called the fastest in the world. Its black paint dull but unmistakable, its presence commanding. She had read of it once in an article, its reputation nearly mythic, and here it was, resting on the concrete floor of this forgotten garage. She could barely comprehend how he had acquired it, how he had hidden such a treasure. But the greatest shock awaited near the far wall, where two custom-built bikes stood side by side, their tarps heavy and stiff. When she uncovered the first, she found a machine unlike any she had ever seen before. Its frame stretched long, the chrome shining beneath intricate engravings, the tank painted with the snarling emblem of a wolf. Leather accents decorated the seat, and the handlebars rose high, built for both power and presence. It was not a mass-produced machine. It was her grandfather's creation, born of his own hands, every detail a reflection of him. The second custom was different, but equally breathtaking, a low and lean chopper with flames painted across the tank, the kind of design she had seen only in movies. The craftsmanship was evident in every line, every angle. These were not just motorcycles. They were works of art, forged with care and vision, a declaration of identity. Finally, she came to the last tarp, draped over a shape that looked familiar even in silhouette. She hesitated, her fingers tightening on the fabric, then pulled it away. Her heart leapt. It was a Harley-Davidson Captain America replica, a mirror of the bike made famous in the film Easy Rider, its long front fork and star-spangled tank instantly recognizable. She had watched that movie once with her grandfather, though he had said little, only sitting quietly as the credits rolled. She had not understood then why his eyes had glistened. Now she did. He had not been watching actors on a screen. He had been watching fragments of his own life, his own road. The garage was no longer just a room filled with machines. It was a cathedral, each motorcycle an altar, each creation a testament to who he had been. She stood in the center, turning slowly to take it all in, her breath unsteady, her eyes wet. Around her the walls bore more than machines. Old jackets hung from hooks, their leather stiff with age, patches sewn proudly into their backs. Helmets rested on shelves, some cracked, others polished. Posters of races from Sturgis and Daytona curled at the edges, their colors faded, but their energy intact. A large map of the United States stretched across one wall, pins driven into dozens of towns and highways, tracing journeys that must have carried him across the country. Emily felt overwhelmed. She could no longer think of her grandfather as the frail man she had cared for in his final days. Here, surrounded by the echoes of his life, she saw him as he truly had been. A rider of roads, a builder of legends, a man whose existence had been bound to engines and asphalt, to brotherhood and freedom. At the far end of the workbench, she found a metal cabinet, its drawers stiff with rust. She pulled one open and discovered envelopes filled with papers, registration documents, titles, receipts, records of maintenance. Each was neatly kept, organized with precision, as though he had known someone would one day need to see the proof. There were letters as well, handwritten notes from fellow riders, from friends long gone. In one, scrawled in faded ink, were the words, "Jack Harper rides forever, a wolf among men. He is the road itself." Her hands shook as she set the papers down, her eyes brimming with tears. He had not been forgotten, not by those who mattered. His family had abandoned him, but his brothers of the road had honored him. And now, she thought, it was her turn. She returned to the center of the garage, standing amidst the machines. The Harley, the Indian, the Vincent, the Customs, the Captain America replica. They surrounded her, guardians of a legacy she had barely begun to understand. The silence around her throbbed with meaning, every shadow alive with memory. She thought of the way her family had mocked him, the way they had dismissed his life as wasted. If only they could see this, she thought. If only they could stand where she stood now. But they could not. They would not. And perhaps that was why he had kept it all hidden, protected from their greed. He had waited for her, knowingly or not, trusting that one day she would be the one to see him as he truly was. As the light dimmed outside and the garage grew colder, Emily covered the machines again, not to hide them, but to protect them, her movements gentle, reverent. She locked the doors once more and slipped the key into her pocket, her resolve steady. When she returned to the house and sank into his chair, she closed her eyes and let the images of the day wash over her. The collection of legends stood waiting in the dark, but they no longer felt like secrets. They felt like gifts, entrusted to her alone. And she knew then that her journey was no longer about grief. It was about revelation, about truth, about carrying forward the story of a man the world had never truly seen. That night, long after she had pulled the heavy doors of the garage shut and locked them with trembling hands, Emily lay awake in her grandfather's bed, the ceiling above her faintly illuminated by the glow of the moon. Her body ached from hours of uncovering and lifting, but her mind was too restless for sleep. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the gleam of chrome, the curve of a tank, the patches on the leather jackets, the faded map with its constellation of pins. The garage was no longer simply a place of tools and shadows. It had become a sanctuary, a treasure chest of stories hidden from a world too blind to care. Her grandfather had lived not as the forgotten relic her family believed him to be, but as a builder, a dreamer, a rider of roads who had carried entire worlds inside his silence. She rose at dawn, her eyes raw from lack of rest, and drifted through the house in the pale light. Every object seemed alive now, heavy with meaning. The old kettle in the kitchen, the framed photographs in the hallway, the books stacked on a shelf. Each carried his touch, his presence. Yet it was the garage that pulled at her, the thought of those machines resting in darkness, waiting. She brewed coffee but did not drink it, her hands too restless to hold still. Instead, she found herself pacing until finally she pushed through the back door and crossed the damp grass, the cold air stinging her lungs. Inside the garage, the dust still hung in the air, where she had disturbed it the day before, and the outlines of the motorcycles under their covers loomed like sentinels. She stood for a long time in silence, listening to her own breath, to the faint ticking of metal cooling in the morning chill. It felt less like stepping into a room and more like entering a church, one dedicated not to saints carved in stone, but to iron and chrome, to freedom bound to wheels and roaring engines. She realized with a sudden clarity that this place was not meant to be dismantled, not meant to be stripped of its meaning and sold piece by piece. It was a living story, and she was its keeper. Yet even as that conviction filled her chest, another sound intruded. Tires crunching on gravel, a door slamming, voices carried on the morning air. Emily stiffened and turned as her Uncle David and Aunt Martha appeared at the edge of the yard, their expressions sharp with impatience. They had not come to mourn, not come to help. They had come for what they believed was theirs. David walked straight toward her, his heavy boots striking the earth with irritation. "So you've been poking around in that garage," he said, his voice tight. "About time someone got rid of all that junk. We'll call an auctioneer, clear it out, and split what it brings. Might get a few $100s for scrap." Emily stared at him, her hands tightening around the key in her pocket. Junk. Scrap. The words struck her like blows. They had no idea. They had never cared to look. Martha moved closer, folding her arms. "Don't tell me you're getting sentimental about old motorcycles. You can't afford to keep them, not with your bills and your debt. Better to take what money you can before the rust eats them alive." Emily wanted to shout, to drag them into the garage and force their eyes open to the truth. But she saw at once that it would be useless. They would not see beauty or history or legacy. They would see dollar signs. They would call collectors, barter for prices, strip away everything her grandfather had guarded so carefully. He had hidden it from them for a reason. She could not betray that reason now. She lifted her chin, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her chest. "The garage is mine. The will left it all to me. You won't touch a thing." David laughed, a bitter mocking sound. "Yours? What do you think you're going to do with it? You're a girl who can barely pay her rent. Don't be foolish." But Emily did not falter. She felt the weight of the key pressing against her palm, felt the silent presence of the machines behind her, and something inside her hardened like steel. "I won't sell them. Not now, not ever. They're not junk. They're his life, and I'll make sure the world knows it." Her aunt scoffed, muttering something about wasted potential, but Emily turned away, refusing to let their words pierce her resolve. They left soon after, muttering angrily about lawyers and wasted property, but their threats rolled off her like water. For the first time in weeks, she felt certain. When the yard was quiet again, she unlocked the garage and stepped inside, her breath rising in clouds against the cool air. She moved from bike to bike, touching each one as though taking an oath. The Harley Knucklehead, the Indian Chief, the Panhead, the Scout, the Vincent, the Customs, the Captain America replica, all of them stood around her, silent and patient. She whispered to them, words not meant for ears but for presence. "I won't let them take you. I won't let them turn this into money. You're more than that. You're him." The thought came to her then, not as a fleeting idea, but as a seed of purpose, sharp and undeniable. She would not sell the collection. She would preserve it. More than that, she would create a place where others could see it, where strangers could walk among these machines and understand what they meant, who he had been. She would build a museum not in the grand sense of marble halls and velvet ropes, but in the truest sense, a house of memory, a sanctuary for his life. At first the idea frightened her. How could she do such a thing? She had little money left, no experience in curation or mechanics. Yet as she walked the length of the garage, her fingers brushing against the faded leather jackets and the pinned map, she felt her fear replaced by determination. Her grandfather had built these machines, restored them, protected them, all without wealth or help. He had done it because he believed in what they were, in what they stood for. Could she not honor him with the same devotion? She began with small steps. She pulled the tarps neatly, folding them and setting them aside, leaving the motorcycles uncovered in their full dignity. She cleaned the workbench, stacking the photographs and letters into boxes labeled with care. She wiped dust from the helmets, polished the cracked visors until they gleamed faintly once more. Every action felt sacred, a ritual of restoration, as though she were breathing life back into what had slept too long in silence. As she worked, she remembered the letters she had found tucked among the papers. Words of brotherhood, of admiration, of gratitude. Jack Harper rides forever, a wolf among men. She read them aloud in the quiet garage, her voice breaking but steadying again as she spoke his name. Each line affirmed her choice. He had not been forgotten by the road, and now he would not be forgotten by the world. In the evenings, she sat at the old kitchen table, sketching ideas on scraps of paper. She pictured display stands, photographs hung in rows, shelves lined with helmets and jackets, a map on the wall with pins still gleaming. She pictured a sign above the garage doors, the Jack Harper Motorcycle Collection. But more than that, she saw it as a place of gathering, where engines would rumble in the yard and riders would come, not to buy or sell, but to honor, to remember. Her family's laughter echoed faintly in her mind, their voices mocking. Why waste your time? Why waste your money? But she no longer cared. She understood something they never could. That worth was not measured in dollars, but in meaning, in memory, in legacy. She had been chosen, by fate or by his silent trust, to carry that forward. By the end of that week, the decision was no longer a fragile thought, but a conviction rooted deep inside her. She would turn the garage into a museum. She would preserve the bikes, the jackets, the letters, the map. She would show the world the man Jack Harper had been, a rider, a brother, a dreamer who had lived his life on the road. And in that resolve, Emily found her grief transformed. She no longer felt crushed by loss, no longer felt alone in her burden. She felt connected to him, to the machines, to the thousands of unseen riders who had once known his name. She felt, for the first time since his passing, a sense of forward motion, as though the road itself had opened before her and invited her to ride. When she locked the garage that night and looked up at the stars glittering faintly above, she whispered her promise into the cool air. "I will honor you. I will keep your story alive." And though the night offered no reply, she felt certain that somewhere, somehow, her grandfather heard her. The decision was made. There would be no turning back. The days that followed Emily's decision seemed to move with a new rhythm, as though time itself had shifted to accompany her resolve. The grief that had clung to her in heavy waves softened into something else, a quiet strength, a certainty of purpose that carried her from the moment she woke until exhaustion finally pushed her into uneasy sleep at night. The garage no longer felt like a place of shadows and secrets, but like a workshop of destiny, where each step she took brought her closer to the task she had claimed as her own. Every morning she crossed the yard with the key warm in her palm, unlocking the doors with a reverence that bordered on ritual, stepping into the scent of oil and metal, dust and leather. She began with cleaning. It was slow, grueling work, but it grounded her, connected her to the space and to him. Dust rose in clouds as she swept the floor, her hands blistered from scrubbing the workbench and sorting through boxes, her back aching as she polished chrome and leather that had long been forgotten under their covers. Yet as she worked, the machines transformed. What had seemed silent and weary only days before now began to shine, their forms reclaiming dignity. The Harley knucklehead gleamed beneath her rag. The Indian chief's saddlebags softened under her careful cleaning. The Vincent's black body regained some of its dark luster. Each bike seemed to wake beneath her touch, their details sharp again, their histories vibrating in the stillness of the room. The jackets and helmets she found hanging stiff with time she cleaned and restored, arranging them carefully on hooks, envisioning the day when others would stand in awe before them. The faded posters she pressed gently flat, sliding them into protective sleeves, whispering to herself that they would soon find their place on walls where they could speak again of races and roads. Even the map, curling and yellowed, she treated with reverence, smoothing its edges, tracing the pins that told of journeys long past. She imagined her grandfather leaning over it, plotting his next ride, his next gathering, his next stretch of freedom. But Emily knew that cleaning alone was not enough. To build what she envisioned, she would need help. The motorcycles, though proud in their stillness, were not whole. Their engines had been dormant too long, their tires cracked, their chains stiff with rust. They needed hands more skilled than hers, hands that knew the language of engines the way her grandfather had. So she reached beyond the house, beyond the garage, into the town and beyond. She visited a small repair shop on the edge of the city, a place her grandfather had once taken her as a child when she rode in the back of his truck. The owner, a broad-shouldered man named Carl with grease-stained hands and eyes that lit up when she spoke of Jack Harper, agreed without hesitation to help restore the machines. "Your grandfather was a legend around here," Carl said, his voice softened by memory. "Not everyone understood him, but those who knew. We'll be proud to bring his bikes back to life." Carl brought with him two younger mechanics, men who had grown up hearing stories of the Iron Wolves and of Jack's rides across the country. They worked alongside Emily in the garage, their tools clinking, their voices low with respect as they examined the engines, the frames, the worn tires. Piece by piece they disassembled, polished, replaced, and rebuilt. Emily watched, learning as she went, her hands trembling but steadying, with each bolt she tightened, each chain she oiled. Together they coaxed breath back into the machines, and for the first time in decades the garage began to echo, not just with silence but with the growl of engines. The first time the Harley roared to life, Emily nearly cried. The sound filled the room, deep and powerful, reverberating in her bones. It was as though her grandfather himself had returned, his voice carried in the thrum of the machine. She stood with her hands over her mouth, her eyes wet, as the mechanics grinned and nodded. "He would have loved to see this," one of them said, and Emily could only nod, too choked to reply. Word began to spread. At first it was only among the mechanics and their friends, whispered in bars and at roadside diners. But soon it reached farther. Old riders who had once known Jack Harper, who had ridden beside him on highways and gathered with him at rallies, heard that his garage was alive again. Letters and messages began to arrive, emails from clubs across the state, phone calls from men and women who carried the memory of the Iron Wolves in their hearts. Some sent photographs of themselves with Jack in younger days, leaning on their bikes with smiles as wide as the horizon. Others sent stories, small fragments of nights at rallies, of races, of kindnesses he had shown them when the world had turned hard. Emily pinned each letter, each photograph, to a board in the garage, expanding her vision of what the museum would become. It was no longer only about the motorcycles, though they remained the shining heart of it. It was about the man, about his life, about the way he had touched others without asking for anything in return. She realized she was building not only a collection, but a shrine, not only a museum, but a story that the world would finally be able to hear. Her family, however, grew restless. David returned once more, his anger sharper this time. He sneered at the mechanics, accused Emily of wasting what could have been a fortune. Martha whispered behind her back in the grocery store, telling neighbors that Emily had lost her mind, that she was clinging to rust instead of moving forward with her life. But for each word of scorn, Emily found 10 words of encouragement from strangers who believed, who remembered, who wanted to help. The balance shifted, and she no longer felt small in the shadow of their cruelty. She felt anchored, her grandfather's voice steady in her chest. By the end of the month, the garage was transformed. The motorcycles stood proud, polished and humming, their engines ready. The jackets and helmets were displayed with care. The map hung clean and framed. The letters and photographs arranged in glass cases that Carl had built himself. The space felt alive, pulsing with history and reverence. Yet Emily knew the true test was still to come. She needed to open it, to invite others in, to let the story breathe beyond these walls. So she sat at the kitchen table late into the night, her laptop glowing in the dark, crafting messages that she sent to motorcycle clubs across the country. She attached photographs of the restored bikes, of the garage shining like it had never done before. She told them of Jack Harper, of the Iron Wolves, of the legacy that had been hidden too long. And she invited them, humbly but with conviction, to come. Not to buy, not to take, but to honor. The responses stunned her. From the East Coast to the West, from Texas to Montana, riders promised to come. Clubs pledged their attendance, some writing that they would arrive in full force, their members riding in long lines of chrome and thunder. Old friends of Jack's wrote that they had waited decades for a chance to ride in his name again. Emily's heart swelled with each reply. She imagined the sound of engines echoing across the valley, the sight of thousands of bikes rolling into town. She imagined her grandfather's smile, if he could see it, his eyes shining as he once more became part of the road he had loved. Her family, when they heard of it, scoffed openly. "No one will come," Martha said. "You'll be standing there alone, embarrassed, while people laugh at you." David muttered about lawsuits and wasted land. But Emily no longer listened. She knew better. She had felt the rumble already in the letters, in the voices of those who remembered. As the day of the opening drew near, Emily worked tirelessly, sleeping little, driven by purpose. She arranged chairs outside the garage, borrowed tents from neighbors, ordered food from the local diner. The townspeople, curious at first, grew swept up in her passion and began to help, offering supplies, painting signs, stringing lights. What had started as her solitary mission became a communal effort, the town itself preparing to welcome something larger than it had ever seen. On the eve of the opening, Emily stood in the garage alone. The motorcycles gleamed in the lamplight, the jackets hung proud, the letters whispered from their glass cases. She touched the Harley's handlebars one last time and closed her eyes, breathing deeply. "Tomorrow," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Tomorrow they'll know who you were." And outside in the still night, the faint, distant growl of engines seemed to answer, rolling like thunder over the horizon, heralding the dawn of a day that would change everything. The morning of the opening dawned slow and heavy with anticipation, as though even the sky understood what was about to unfold. Emily woke before the first light touched the curtains, her heart already pounding in her chest, her body restless with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She had dreamt all night of roads, of engines roaring through endless plains, of her grandfather's voice carried on the wind. When she rose and stepped into the quiet kitchen, she found herself unable to eat. She brewed coffee but left it untouched on the table, her hands trembling too much to lift the cup. The house around her seemed alive with silence, as though waiting with her. Every chair, every photograph, every corner of the room had gathered in stillness, bearing witness to the culmination of all her nights of labor and all the secrets she had uncovered. By mid-morning, she could already hear it, the low, distant rumble, faint at first but growing steadily until the sound vibrated through the very earth beneath her feet. She stepped outside and felt her breath catch in her throat. Over the horizon came the first line of motorcycles, their chrome flashing in the pale sunlight, their engines rising like a chorus of thunder. They poured down the highway in waves, the columns stretching farther than she could see, leather jackets gleaming, flags streaming in the wind. It was as though the entire country had risen from its roads to converge on this one small place. Neighbors emerged from their houses, their faces pale with astonishment. Cars pulled over to the side of the street, drivers climbing out to watch as the procession grew, louder and more immense with each passing minute. By the time the first column reached the edge of the town, the air was thick with the sound of engines, so powerful it seemed to press against the walls of houses, to shake windows and doors. Emily stood frozen at the gate, her eyes brimming with tears, as hundreds upon hundreds of riders passed her, their faces solemn, their eyes respectful. Many lifted their hands in greeting as they roared past, their gestures carrying not words but a bond, a recognition that transcended language. By noon, the yard was filled. The field beside the house overflowed with motorcycles lined in neat rows, gleaming like an army of steel and chrome. Riders dismounted, removing their helmets, straightening their jackets adorned with patches from clubs across the nation. Some were young, their eyes wide with awe, while others were old, their faces etched with lines carved by years on the road. Yet all carried the same reverence, the same solemn pride, as they stepped into the place Emily had built. The air smelled of oil and leather, of dust, and the faint smoke of exhaust. But more than that, it smelled of belonging, of a gathering long overdue. Emily opened the garage doors with her hands trembling, and as the light spilled across the machines within, a hush fell over the crowd. The Harley knucklehead gleamed under the sun, the Indian chief's leather shone. The Vincent Black Shadow seemed almost to glow with dark fire. The Customs stood proud with their snarling wolf emblems and flame-painted tanks, and the Captain America replica seemed to vibrate with memory. Jackets lined the walls. Photographs glistened beneath glass. The great map stretched proudly, its pins like stars across the country. For a long moment no one spoke. No one moved. They simply stood in silence, eyes wide, taking in what had been hidden for so many years. And then, slowly, the murmurs began. Old men whispered stories to younger riders, pointing to machines they remembered from rallies decades before. Women traced the photographs with their fingers, their lips trembling as they recalled the laughter in the roads. Some wept openly, their shoulders shaking as they stood before the bikes, whispering Jack's name as though he were still alive among them. Emily walked through them, her voice quiet but steady, telling the story of her grandfather as she had come to know it through his letters, his photographs, his machines. She spoke not as a scholar or a curator, but as his blood, his granddaughter, the one who had stood by him when no one else would. She told them how her family had abandoned him, how they had called him a burden, how they had sneered at his life as wasted. And then she told them of the garage, of the treasures hidden beneath tarps, of the truth he had guarded. Her words trembled at first, but as she looked into the faces of the riders before her, faces shining with respect, with tears, with pride, her voice grew stronger. "He was never forgotten," she said, standing by the Harley, her hand resting on its handlebars. "Not by the road, not by those who rode with him. He lived a life you could not measure in money or in the scorn of those who never cared to understand. He lived it here, in these machines, in these roads, in all of you." And now the world will know who Jack Harper truly was. The crowd erupted then, not in cheers but in the roar of engines. Riders mounted their bikes and revved them in unison, the sound deafening, powerful, like thunder rolling across the valley. The ground shook beneath Emily's feet, her chest vibrated with the force of it, and she felt tears stream down her face. It was not noise. It was a salute, a final honor to the man they had come to remember. For a long time the engines roared, until it seemed the sky itself might split with the sound. And then, one by one, they fell silent again, leaving only the echo of what they had declared. On the edge of the crowd, her relatives stood stiff and pale. David and Martha had arrived late, drawn by curiosity or by greed, but now they were frozen in disbelief. They had come expecting to see Emily embarrassed, surrounded by scraps. Instead, they saw thousands of riders gathered, a yard filled with gleaming motorcycles, a garage transformed into a sanctuary of memory. They saw faces wet with tears, heard engines salute a man they had mocked. Their mouths opened, but no words came. For the first time they seemed small, irrelevant, like shadows in the glare of truth. Emily did not approach them. She did not need to. Their silence was its own confession. She knew now that she owed them nothing. Her grandfather had chosen her, not them, and the sight before her proved that choice had been just. The rest of the day unfolded like a ceremony. Riders moved through the garage in steady streams, touching the bikes with reverence, leaving flowers at their bases, pinning patches from their own clubs onto the walls in tribute. Some stood outside sharing stories. Their laughter mingled with tears. Food was served, music drifted from a nearby speaker, but always the heart of the gathering remained the same. The machines, the man who had loved them, and the granddaughter who had carried his story forward. As the sun sank low and the light turned golden, Emily stepped back from the garage and looked at the sea of motorcycles stretching across the field, their chrome reflecting the dying light like fire. Engines began to start again, one by one, until the air vibrated once more with sound. Columns formed, lines of riders preparing to leave, but not before circling the house in one great loop, a final tribute. Thousands of bikes roared as one, encircling the place Jack Harper had called home, their engines blending into a song that spoke of loyalty, of memory, of a legacy carried forward. Emily stood at the gate, her hand resting on the post, her heart aching but proud. She watched them ride off into the horizon, the sound of their engines fading like distant thunder until the silence returned. Only then did she turn back toward the garage where the bikes stood gleaming, the letters and photographs whispering their stories, the map glowing faintly in the last light of day. She closed the doors gently, locking them with care, and pressed her forehead against the wood for a moment. In her chest there was no longer grief, only peace, and something stronger still. Purpose. She had done what she promised. She had honored him. She had shown the world who he was. When she returned to the house and sat in his chair, the night gathering around her, she felt his presence not as a shadow but as a warmth, a certainty. She whispered into the silence, her voice steady and sure. I will keep it alive. I will carry it forward. You ride forever, Grandpa. And in that moment, with the stars beginning to burn above the quiet town and the faint echo of engines lingering in the air, Emily knew the story was not ending, but only beginning. The museum would grow, riders would return, the road would carry his name. His life, once mocked and dismissed, had become a legend. And through her, through the machines he had loved, through the thousands who had come to honor him, Jack Harper would never be forgotten again. Don't miss stories like this one. Hit that subscribe button right now so you'll never be left out. And if this story shook you, wait until you see what's coming next. Click on the next video on your screen. It's even more unbelievable. And share this video with your friends and family. Let them experience the twist that no one saw coming. The more people who know this story, the more powerful it becomes.